somewhere in the intellectual ferment of the early centuries of the Common Era, though the tradition insists on a much earlier hand. A Sanskrit thinker set down a question that had troubled every organized society before him, and would trouble everyone after. What does a state actually consist of? Not in the abstract sense of what a state ought to be, but in the hard, functional sense of what its working parts are, and what happens when one of those parts fails. The answer he gave, in the opening chapter of the 6th book of the Kauṭilyam Arthaśāstram, was this: Swami, Amatya, Janapada, Durga, Kosha, Danda, Mitrani, Prakritaya, 7 constituent elements, 7 prakritis, the word meaning something closer to natural essences or irreducible natures than a mere checklist. Together they constitute what the tradition would come to call the Saptanga, from Sapta, 7, and Anga, limbs, the 7-limbed body of the state. The text in which this enumeration appears was lost for centuries. It survived on palm leaves, copied and recopied in the dark between the ancient world and the modern one, until a Sanskrit scholar named Arthaśāstra found a 17th-century manuscript in Tanjore in 1904, published the text in 1909, and his translation in 1915. The world had been governing itself, theorizing about power, writing constitutions and founding empires, entirely without this document. When it finally reappeared, scholars recognized immediately that it was not one man's treatise, but a layered accumulation. The text names its author as both Kauṭilya and Vishnugupta, and the tradition assigns it to Chanakya, the legendary counselor of Chandragupta Maurya. The scholarship since 1965 has questioned that identification, pointing to stylistic inconsistencies and anachronisms that place at least the surviving recension in the early centuries of the Common Era. We hold this authorship loosely. What we do not hold loosely is the architecture of thought inside the text. Before Kauṭilya reaches the 7 limbs, he establishes why they are necessary at all. The foundation is a concept he does not invent, but deploys with precision. Matsya Nyaya, the law of the fish. Matsya is fish, Nyaya is logic, justice, the way things fall. The law of the fish is this: without structure, the large devour the small. This is not metaphor for Kauṭilya. It is diagnosis. It is his account of what human existence looks like in the absence of sovereign authority. The strong eat the weak. The territory dissolves into terror. It is, in modern terms, his state of nature. And it is from the intolerable weight of Matsya Nyaya that the entire Saptanga framework rises as a response. So the first limb, the Swamin, the sovereign, the Lord, does not represent arbitrary power. Kauṭilya is explicit on this. The king he envisions is a Rajarshi, a royal sage, shaped by self-discipline, governed by wisdom, and defined by a single orienting principle stated elsewhere in the Arthaśāstra with unusual directness. In the happiness of the subjects lies the happiness of the king, and in what is beneficial to the subjects, his own benefit. The Sanskrit word beneath this passage, the word that names the telos of the entire system, is yogakshema, from yoga, meaning acquisition or union, and kshema, safety and preservation, welfare, well-being, the security of a life that can be lived without constant fear. The Swamin exists to produce yogakshema. Without that orientation, the limb is malformed from the start. The second limb is the amatya, the minister, the counselor, the entire administrative ecology surrounding the king. The word amatya comes from a and matya, meaning roughly one who stands beside, one who is near. These are not merely functionaries. Kauṭilya describes an elaborate system of selection demanding moral integrity, financial honesty, infallible memory, patience, wisdom, and what the text calls a friendly nature. Not warmth as sentiment, but a disposition that earns trust. The amatya represents what we might call collective intelligence. The Swamin's vision, however acute, remains uninformed without the counsel that flows through this second limb. The king who dismisses his advisors does not become more powerful, he becomes more blind. The third limb is Janapada. Jana means people. Pada means place, foot, the ground where feet are planted. The Janapada is the territory with its population, the land insofar as it is inhabited and cultivated and alive. Kauṭilya is specific about what a healthy Janapada requires. It must accommodate people and provide them occupation, offer arable land and forests and mines, maintain roads and rivers, and give access to trade. Without a sound Janapada, the treasury has no source. Without source, the treasury fails. Without the treasury, the army dissolves. The interdependence is not decorative. It is the structural logic of the entire system. Consider a family that has held together for 30 years. Parents, grown children, the web of obligation and affection that constitutes a household. When the parents age and the money that once held the extended family in proximity begins to thin, the eldest sibling who held the family's informal council quietly withdraws. The younger ones, cut off from both the material base and the advisory center, begin making decisions in isolation. Loyalties that were natural begin to feel optional. This is not a political crisis, but it has the same anatomy as the one Kauṭilya is describing, a system of interdependent limbs in which the weakening of one translates structurally through all the others. The fourth limb is Durga, the fort, the place of protection, literally the difficult to access. Durga represents not only military architecture, but the entire principle of secured space, the capacity to defend what has been built. The capital city, Kauṭilya tells us, is the largest and most important of the fortifications. It is the administrative, economic, and military hub of the realm. The text specifies different kinds of forts: hill forts, water forts, desert forts, each suited to its terrain. What matters psychologically in this framework is that Durga is the limb of boundary, the state's capacity to say, this is protected space, and we intend to keep it so. The fifth limb is Kosha, the storehouse, the financial foundation without which nothing else is sustainable. Kauṭilya is unsparing here. Without a sound treasury, the state cannot sustain its army, its administration, or its welfare functions. Kosha is the limb that makes the other limbs operable over time. It is not the highest limb in terms of dignity, that position belongs to the Svamin, but it may be the most load-bearing in terms of daily function. When the treasury weakens, the fort cannot be maintained. When the fort fails, the territory becomes vulnerable. When the territory is threatened, the population scatters. The text draws these connections explicitly. The weakening of Kosha translates directly into the weakening of Janapada. The sixth limb is Danda, and here Kautilya's thinking is most frequently misread. Danda is the rod, the staff, the instrument of coercive authority. By extension, it encompasses the army, the judiciary, the police, the entire enforcement apparatus of the state. The science it generates is called Danda Niti, the policy of the rod, the governance of proportional force. But Kauṭilya does not regard Danda as an end. He regards it as a neutral instrument, to be wielded not from cruelty, but with precision and justice. Punishment used injudiciously, he argues, loses popular respect. Danda held carelessly corrupts the state faster than any external enemy. What Kauṭilya is encoding in this sixth limb is the proposition that order requires force, but force divorced from proportion and purpose is itself a form of Matsya-nyaya wearing the king's face. The seventh and final limb is Mitra, the ally, the friend. Mitra literally means friend, and the political register of the word in the Arthaśāstra acknowledges two kinds. The Sahaja Mitra is the natural ally, whose friendship descends from earlier generations, inherited like land or language. The Kritrima Mitra is the acquired ally, the friendship specifically cultivated for protection and mutual benefit. This seventh limb is the one that opens the Saptanga outward. No state survives in isolation. Kauṭilya understood this, and he embedded it in the very structure of his political anatomy. The seventh limb reaching beyond the body of the state to the world outside it. A man in his late 40s, who has spent a decade managing his own declining health and his father's increasing dementia, finds himself increasingly without the external connections that once sustained him. His old friendships, the ones that were simply there, inherited from a shared history, Sahaja in Kautilya's vocabulary, have gone quiet under the weight of his preoccupation. The acquired ones, the friendships he actively tended, have drifted because he stopped tending them. He is not weak in any of the other 6 dimensions of his private life. He is disciplined, thoughtful, financially careful, protective of what he has built. But the Mitra is failing. And Kautilya's framework tells us what happens then. A system that loses its external support becomes rigid and then brittle. Even the most internally sound state does not survive indefinitely without alliance. This is what the chariot metaphor in the Arthaśāstra is doing when it appears. Together, the text says, the 7 elements constitute the state as an organism, like a chariot composed of 7 parts fitted and subservient to one another. The chariot does not move on its finest wheel alone. It moves on the coordination of all 7 components, their proportions maintained, their interdependence honored. The text is not naive about power. It does not pretend that Matsya can be permanently dissolved, only held back by the vigilance of a system that keeps all 7 limbs healthy. What it insists on is that the king who is energetic and disciplined will produce a state in which officials and subjects mirror his industry. And the king who neglects the welfare of his subjects has already begun the process of returning the realm to the law of the fish. The Saptanga theory was not entirely Kautilya's invention. The Manusmriti holds a version of it. The Mahabharata's Shanti Parva engages it. The Vishnu Dharmottara Purana and the Matsya Purana adapt and transmit it. The concept was almost universally received as the standard framework for understanding ancient Indian statecraft. But what is distinctive about the Arthaśāstric version is its structural rigor, its insistence that the 7 limbs are not a list but an organism, and that the organism's health cannot be located in any single part. What to carry forward into your actual day. Any system you belong to, a household, a friendship, a community held together over years, has its own version of these 7 limbs. There is the animating center, the wise counsel beside it, the shared ground where people plant their feet, the protected space, the material base that makes everything else possible, the proportional force that keeps boundaries real, and the outside world of relationship that keeps the whole from turning inward. Neglect any one of these, and the chariot does not crash immediately. It wobbles, it slows, it begins to pull to one side. Kautilya's deepest insight is not tactical. It is this: governance of a state, of a family, of a life, is a practice of sustained attention to all 7 things at once. The weak do not need to be eaten.